The morning air was warm and quiet as David, a tall man with calm eyes and steady hands, drove a plain white delivery van through the streets of a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where people waved to each other while watering their lawns and children rode bicycles down the sidewalks, yet beneath that calm surface was a tension no one could see, because David was not an ordinary delivery driver but the chief of the Army Criminal Investigation Division, a man who had spent his entire life searching for truth in places where lies and corruption tried to hide, and today he was undercover, dressed in jeans and a simple shirt, with a delivery cap pulled low over his face, so that no one would recognize the leader hidden inside the role of a common worker, because his mission required patience, silence, and courage. For months his team had been following reports of abuse of authority and possible criminal ties that were spreading fear among people who had once trusted the badge meant to protect them, and now it was his job to see with his own eyes if those suspicions were true, because reading files in an office could not show the true nature of men when they thought they were dealing with someone powerless. He parked the van near a corner where tall oak trees gave shade to the sidewalk and tried to look like he was checking his delivery route, his hands moving slowly across papers that looked ordinary but inside carried coded notes and signals for his team members, who were spread carefully around the neighborhood, blending in as joggers, neighbors, or passers-by, all connected by small radios and signals known only to them. David's heart was steady, his breath even, but deep inside he knew every second carried risk, because if anyone saw through his disguise too early, the entire operation would collapse and the people depending on him would lose the chance to see justice. As he glanced in the mirror, he saw the glint of a police car approaching, its shape growing larger until it slowed and stopped behind his van, and in that moment David reminded himself that the first test of every undercover role was not the danger itself but the ability to act ordinary, to look harmless, to become invisible in plain sight. The car door opened, and out stepped an officer with a sharp stare and firm steps, his boots striking the pavement with authority, his hand resting on his belt in a way that was both commanding and heavy, and as he walked toward the van, the silence of the street seemed to grow louder, every sound magnified by the pressure of the moment. David rolled down the window smoothly, as any delivery driver would do, and gave a polite nod, keeping his tone light as he said, "Morning, sir." The officer leaned slightly closer, eyes scanning the inside of the van with suspicion, and without greeting he asked in a firm, almost impatient voice, "What's in the back?" It was a simple question on the surface, but David heard the weight behind it, the tone of a man who was not asking out of routine but demanding as if his authority alone was reason enough. David answered calmly, his voice carrying no hint of challenge, only the softness of a man who had nothing to hide, just packages, making deliveries for the morning route. His words were plain, but his mind was sharp, watching every detail, the way the officer's eyes narrowed, the way his shoulders tensed, the quick glance toward the back door of the van that seemed less about safety and more about control. The officer gave a short nod and then, with a voice harder than before, said, "Open it." For a brief moment the air was heavy, and David felt the weight of the order not as a delivery man but as the leader of an operation balancing on a thin line, because inside those boxes were not only real packages but also carefully hidden equipment his team had planted, cameras and receivers disguised so well that even a curious eye might overlook them, but the danger was not the boxes themselves, it was the risk that the officer might sense something was wrong, might question too much, might push too far. David nodded slowly, never breaking the act, stepped out of the van, and walked around with calm, measured steps, as though he was simply a man following instructions without question. His hand rested on the latch, and for the smallest second he caught sight of a figure at the corner, one of his team members disguised as a jogger tying his shoe, ready to signal if backup was needed. David pulled open the door, revealing rows of neatly stacked cardboard boxes, labeled with ordinary addresses and taped securely, the perfect image of a day's work for a delivery driver. The officer leaned in slightly, eyes sharp as he tapped on one of the boxes as though trying to hear what was hidden inside. "What's in these?" he asked again, his voice carrying doubt. David pointed to the invoice taped neatly to the side, his movements casual, his tone still calm. "Electronics, office supplies. You can check the papers if you like." The officer stared a moment longer, then stepped back, his face unreadable, his silence louder than words. David closed the doors quietly, careful not to seem rushed or afraid, and waited. Finally, the officer gave a short grunt, his gaze lingering on David as though searching for cracks in the mask he wore, then muttered, "Don't stay here too long," before turning back to his car. David climbed back into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove slowly forward, the hum of the van steady even as his mind replayed every second of the encounter. He knew what had just happened was more than a routine stop, it was a test, the kind of moment that revealed the unseen character of men who held power, and though the officer had left, David knew this would not be the last time their paths crossed. As the houses slipped past his window and the sun climbed higher into the sky, David's heart stayed steady, but deep inside he carried the truth of what had begun. The sting operation had only just started, and every mile ahead would bring him closer to uncovering the secrets that threatened to harm the very people he had sworn to protect. The road stretched ahead as David guided the van slowly out of the quiet neighborhood, his eyes fixed on the street but his mind replaying the encounter with the officer who had ordered him to open the back, because though it had ended without immediate trouble, David could feel the weight of the man's suspicion following him like a shadow, and in undercover work, shadows often meant danger that was not yet visible but always near. He drove with steady hands, keeping his disguise intact, while at the same time listening to faint signals from his earpiece, where one of his team members whispered updates about movements they had noticed in nearby streets, subtle signs that confirmed their operation was touching sensitive ground. For months, whispers had grown about corruption tied to certain officers who acted less like guardians of the community and more like rulers of fear, and though David had read every report carefully, he knew that true understanding came only when he could see the actions with his own eyes, when he could watch how men behaved when they thought no one important was watching them. As he turned onto a larger road, blending into the flow of traffic with other delivery trucks and cars, he thought back to his years in service, the many missions where danger was loud and clear, compared to this mission where danger was quiet, disguised, hidden in daily routines, yet just as sharp. The plan was not only to expose criminal dealings but also to test the very character of those who wore the badge, because corruption did not always reveal itself through large crimes but sometimes through small acts of arrogance, abuse, or silence. David parked near a gas station a few miles away, pretending to refuel while actually using the time to adjust a hidden device inside the van, a receiver connected to cameras disguised within the packages, devices that would quietly record every interaction and send signals back to his team. He moved casually, his hands steady, his face calm, so that anyone watching would see nothing unusual, only a delivery driver completing his errands. As he leaned against the van for a moment, sipping from a bottle of water, he saw a reflection in the glass window of the store, a black sedan slowing down just across the street, its windows tinted, its presence lingering longer than an ordinary driver would stay. David recognized the subtle pattern at once. Surveillance was not always about uniforms, and whoever sat inside that car was watching him closely. He made no move to show recognition, simply finishing his water, paying for the gas, and driving away with a casual wave to the clerk, but inside he filed the moment carefully, because in this game, every detail mattered. As the day stretched into afternoon, David continued his route, stopping at different points that were part of the cover story, always alert, always aware of the unseen eyes that could be anywhere. His team remained silent in the background, giving short-coded updates, confirming that everything was in motion, yet tension grew, because they all knew the officer who had stopped him earlier was not finished with his curiosity. Back at the precinct, that same officer, whose name was Mark, sat at his desk with narrowed eyes, tapping his pen against a notepad, his mind replaying the face of the quiet delivery driver who had spoken with calmness that did not match the nervousness he expected from ordinary workers. Something about the man had unsettled him, though he could not explain why, and the more he thought about it, the more he convinced himself that the van deserved closer inspection. He picked up his phone, made a brief call, and soon after, another patrol was quietly instructed to keep watch for the same white van, a small order that carried large consequences, because without knowing it, Mark had just stepped into the very sting David had set. Meanwhile, David turned into another neighborhood, parking near a row of houses where his cover story required him to make deliveries. He carried 2 boxes up to a porch, knocked lightly, and waited, though he knew no one would answer, because those deliveries were staged by his team, part of the operation designed to make his presence believable. As he set the boxes down and walked back to the van, he noticed a figure standing at the end of the street, a man pretending to check his phone but glancing up too often, his stance too stiff to belong to an ordinary resident. David felt the weight of the gaze but gave no sign of recognition, instead slipping back into the van with the same steady movements, his expression unchanged. He started the engine and drove away slowly, blending once more into the ordinary world. Inside, however, his thoughts were sharp, because the pattern was clear. The officer's suspicion had already spread, and eyes were now following his every move. For David, this was both risk and opportunity, because in undercover work, the best evidence often came when pressure forced hidden hands to reveal themselves. If Mark truly was connected to the corruption, his next steps would expose more than words ever could. As evening approached, David pulled into a parking lot near a small diner, one of the predetermined safe spots where his team could rotate shifts and exchange information. He ordered a simple meal, sat alone at a corner booth, and looked out the window as the orange glow of sunset painted the horizon, while across the street, he could see the same black sedan parked once more, its engine off, its windows still. To anyone else it might seem like coincidence, but to David it was confirmation the watchers were growing bold. He finished his meal calmly, left a tip on the table, and walked back to the van without haste, his posture relaxed, his disguise unbroken. Yet inside, his resolve grew stronger, because he knew the storm was building. The officer who had stopped him was pulling strings, the watchers were circling closer, and soon the moment would come when patience would meet confrontation. But David was not afraid. He had faced darker nights and heavier dangers, and he carried with him not only his own strength but the silent strength of the team spread like guardians in the shadows. The van hummed once more as he started it, and with the road stretching ahead into the night, David prepared himself for what was to come, knowing that the real test of his disguise, his mission, and his courage was only beginning. The night grew quiet as David drove the delivery van down a stretch of empty road lit only by scattered streetlights, his eyes steady on the path ahead but his thoughts circling around the pattern of events that had unfolded during the day, because the officer's suspicion was no longer a small detail but a thread pulling him deeper into the heart of the operation, and David knew that once a thread was pulled far enough, the whole fabric of secrecy would unravel, either for the corrupt or for the undercover sting he was leading. He parked the van at a rest area just outside the town, a place chosen carefully by his team because it provided both cover and open view of the roads leading in and out, and there he sat for a while, pretending to rest like any driver might do after a long day of work, while in truth he was listening to updates in his earpiece, quiet signals confirming that watchers were still circling nearby. One agent reported seeing the same black sedan on the highway an hour earlier, keeping a slow but steady distance, while another mentioned that Officer Mark had stayed unusually late at the precinct, making phone calls that seemed more secretive than official, and all of it painted the picture David had been expecting, though it did not make the situation any less dangerous. He leaned back in his seat, his cap pulled low, his eyes half closed, but his mind awake, replaying every second of the earlier encounter with Mark, because men often revealed themselves not through their words but through their tone, their pauses, the weight of how they demanded rather than asked, and to David, the officer's manner had spoken louder than the words themselves. After a while he turned the key, started the engine again, and guided the van back toward the city, choosing a different route to test if the sedan would appear once more, and sure enough, as he merged onto the main road, his mirror caught the faint reflection of headlights keeping just far enough not to seem obvious, yet close enough for a careful man to notice. David gave no sign of recognition, keeping his movements ordinary, his driving steady, because in undercover work the trick was not to run but to let the hunters believe they were unseen, to let them grow confident until their confidence revealed the truth. He drove into another neighborhood, stopped at a corner store, bought a bottle of water, and greeted the clerk with a casual smile, all the while watching through the glass as the black sedan rolled slowly past, its windows reflecting only the faint glow of the streetlights. When he stepped back into the van, he knew the watchers would not give up, and part of him welcomed it, because every step they took closer meant another piece of evidence falling into place. As midnight drew near, he guided the van to an old warehouse on the edge of town, one of the safe points his team had prepared in advance, and there he parked in the shadows while two agents approached quietly from the side entrance, their plain clothes making them look like late-night workers. Inside the warehouse, David finally shed the mask of a delivery driver for a few minutes, speaking in his true steady tone as he gave instructions. He told them about the officer's behavior, the way the sedan had followed, and the importance of letting the watchers believe they were unnoticed. His team listened carefully, their faces serious but confident, because they trusted his leadership and had seen his patience turn dangerous missions into victories before. When the short meeting ended, David returned to the van, pulled his cap back down, and rolled out once more into the night, because he knew the mission was far from done, and the longer he stayed still, the greater the risk of being cornered. On the other side of the city, Officer Mark sat in his small office, his eyes sharp as he stared at a file he had pulled, the delivery routes for that day, his pen tapping against the desk as he whispered to himself that something about that driver did not fit. He could not explain why, but his pride told him that his instincts were right, and he was determined to follow them even if no one else believed him. He made a call to a contact whose number he kept hidden from official records, speaking in a low voice about the white van, about keeping an eye on it, about not letting it slip away, and with that call, he unknowingly tied himself deeper into the very net David's operation was casting. Meanwhile, as the van rolled back onto the highway, David noticed the headlights again, the same silent watchers, and he whispered to himself with calm certainty that patience would soon pay off. He knew he was being tested, and he knew he would let the test play until the truth came forward, because his mission was not to escape suspicion but to gather proof that no denial could erase. The hours passed, the roads shifted from quiet neighborhoods to stretches of highway and back again, and all through the night, David kept his disguise steady, his manner calm, until finally, as dawn began to color the horizon, he parked near another diner, stepped out with a tired gait that made him look like a man exhausted from long hours of delivery work, and went inside for breakfast. He ate slowly, his eyes on the window, watching as the black sedan circled once before finding a spot across the street. To anyone else it was just a car, but to him it was confirmation once again. He sipped his coffee, folded his hands, and allowed himself a small moment of reflection, because undercover work was not just about pretending, it was about endurance, about carrying a mask so long and so well that even the strongest suspicion could not pierce it. And as the sun rose higher, David knew the next stage was near, the moment when Officer Mark's suspicion would drive him to push harder, to demand more, and when that happened, the truth would stand revealed, not because David sought confrontation, but because corruption could not hide forever once it believed it was in control. The day stretched into a heavy silence as David continued driving the plain white van through the city, his disguise as steady as his calm breathing, though inside he could feel the weight of the storm gathering around him, because every sign pointed to the truth that Officer Mark was not simply curious but determined, and determination born from suspicion often led to mistakes that revealed far more than intended, which was exactly what David needed for the sting operation to succeed. He guided the van along familiar streets, delivering boxes at staged addresses, always careful to appear ordinary, never rushing, never hesitating, while his sharp eyes caught glimpses of watchers who thought themselves unseen, a man in a car pretending to read a newspaper, another leaning against a wall with a phone in his hand but eyes fixed too long on the road, and the black sedan that had now become a constant shadow, circling like a hawk that believed its prey was tired. David knew the longer he allowed the watchers to follow, the more confident they would become, and confidence in men hiding secrets was like a flame that grew until it burned their own disguise away. By midday, he parked near a hardware store, stepped out carrying 2 small boxes, and moved with the tired pace of a delivery worker, his back slightly bent as though he had been lifting heavy packages all morning, but when he returned to the van, he saw in the corner of his eye a patrol car pull in 2 spaces behind him, and his heart registered the arrival not with fear but with the calm acceptance of a soldier who had been waiting for this moment. Officer Mark stepped out, his expression firm, his boots striking the pavement with authority as he walked toward the van, his posture carrying the same impatience as the first encounter but with sharper edges, as though suspicion had grown into certainty inside his mind. David rolled down the window, his face calm, his voice polite as he greeted the officer, "Good afternoon, sir." Mark's eyes narrowed, scanning the inside once more before demanding, "Step out of the vehicle." The words carried weight, but David moved slowly, carefully, stepping down with the same humble posture as before, letting the role of an ordinary driver remain unbroken. Mark circled the van, his hand brushing against the side as though testing the strength of the metal, before stopping at the back. "Open it again," he ordered sharply. David gave a small nod, unlocked the latch, and swung the doors wide, revealing once more the neatly stacked boxes with their printed labels, invoices taped to the sides, all appearing perfectly ordinary. Yet Mark did not stop with a glance this time. He stepped closer, his hand tapping the corner of one box, his eyes flicking from the packages to David's face, searching for a reaction. "These routes of yours," he said slowly, "don't match the usual delivery schedules I've seen around here." David tilted his head politely, his tone simple, almost weary. "I just follow the list they give me, sir. I'm new on this route." The words were plain, believable, but Mark's suspicion did not ease. He motioned toward one of the boxes. "Open it." David's fingers brushed the tape of a package, pulling it carefully, revealing nothing more than ordinary electronic supplies inside, wires and small devices exactly as labeled. Mark's eyes darted across the contents, his jaw tightening, because the normality frustrated him. yet his pride refused to let go of the idea that something was hidden. David Ressa led the box with quiet efficiency, his calm movements speaking louder than words, and stepped back without challenge. For a long moment the two men stood in silence, the afternoon sun pressing down, the hum of traffic filling the space between them, until finally Mark spoke again, his voice lower but heavier. "You'll be seeing me again." He closed the van doors himself, his hand lingering on the handle as though trying to leave behind a mark of control, then turned and walked back to his patrol car, his shoulders stiff with frustration. David climbed back into the driver's seat, his hands steady, his face neutral, and started the engine once more, but as he drove away his mind sharpened, because what had just happened confirmed everything he had expected. Mark was digging deeper, not out of duty but out of something personal, something that tied him to the corruption David's team had been sent to uncover. Later that afternoon, David met briefly with two agents at another safe point, passing coded notes that summarized the encounter, and together they quietly mapped out the next step. The plan was simple but risky: allow Mark's suspicion to drive him into making a move that crossed the line, because once he stepped outside proper conduct, the proof would be undeniable. As night fell again, David parked the van near a quiet diner on the edge of town, the same place where the black sedan had followed him before, and sure enough, it appeared again, idling across the street. David entered the diner, ordered a small meal, and sat at the same corner booth, his eyes calm as he watched the reflection of headlights on the glass. Inside, his thoughts were steady: the operation was nearing the breaking point, and soon the mask he wore as a delivery driver would no longer be enough to keep the truth hidden. He thought of the people who had been silenced by fear, of the families who had whispered about officers they could no longer trust, and he reminded himself that this mission was not about one man or one sting. It was about restoring the belief that authority existed to protect, not to oppress. When he finished his meal and stepped outside, the night air was cool, carrying the faint smell of rain, and as he climbed back into the van, he whispered to himself with quiet certainty, "Tomorrow will bring the turn." His hands gripped the steering wheel, steady as always, as the van rolled back into the darkness of the road, the black sedan following at a careful distance, unaware that every step it took closer was another step into the trap that David, the Army CID chief, had been weaving patiently, silently, with the endurance of a man who had spent his life standing against shadows, waiting for the moment when truth would finally step into the light. Dawn was breaking over the city when David guided the plain white van through the quiet streets, the air crisp and filled with the faint hum of early traffic, and though the world seemed ordinary, he knew the moment of truth was near, the moment he had been preparing for through weeks of careful planning, patience, and silent observation, because Officer Mark, whose suspicion had grown into an obsession, was about to make the move that would reveal everything, and David's calm exterior concealed the precise awareness and readiness that only years of experience could build. He parked near a narrow alley behind a small warehouse, a location his team had carefully selected as a controlled environment for the final stage of the operation, and while the sun painted the buildings in shades of gold, he checked the van one last time, making sure the hidden devices were working perfectly, the cameras positioned to capture every angle, and the communication lines to his agents were clear, all while maintaining the perfect disguise of an ordinary delivery driver, tired and unaware of the tension building around him. As he stepped out, carrying two boxes, he noticed a familiar reflection in the glass of the warehouse door, the black sedan, parked across the street, its engine idling, its occupant watching carefully, waiting for the chance to act, and David allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to form, because everything was unfolding exactly as planned. He moved with the casual steps of a man who had just completed a routine delivery, placing the boxes at the door and pretending to check a delivery. list, while his eyes continually scanned the street, noting the precise moment when Mark stepped out of the patrol car, his face set in determination, his boots striking the pavement with authority and tension, unaware that every move he made was being recorded from multiple angles by hidden cameras that would later provide undeniable proof. David greeted the officer with calm politeness, his voice soft yet steady. "Good morning, sir. Beautiful day for deliveries, isn't it?" Mark's eyes narrowed, his body stiff as he approached the van, demanding once more, "Step out of the vehicle." David complied slowly, hands relaxed at his sides, showing no fear, no hesitation, letting the role of a simple delivery man remain unbroken, while inside his mind he prepared for the crucial moment, the moment when Mark's insistence and impatience would expose the very truth David needed. The officer circled the van, his gaze sharp, his voice firm as he said, "Open it. I want to see inside." David nodded, fingers brushing the latch, and swung the back doors open, revealing the neatly stacked boxes, each labeled properly, each appearing ordinary, yet secretly containing the devices that had captured the previous days of surveillance, recordings, and evidence. Mark stepped closer, his eyes flicking to David's face, scanning for a reaction, yet all he saw was calmness, patience, and routine, and his frustration grew because the ordinary appearance of the van and its contents contradicted every suspicion in his mind, leaving him unsure and tense. David pointed politely to one of the invoices, his tone simple, "Everything is as it should be, sir. You can check the documents if you like." The officer hesitated, muttering under his breath, and reached for the box, lifting it slightly, when suddenly David's team, positioned strategically around the warehouse, signaled with lights and subtle gestures that the time had come. Hidden cameras captured every movement, and in that precise moment, David stepped forward with quiet authority, removing the cap and showing the identification that marked him not as a delivery driver but as the chief of the Army Criminal Investigation Division. Mark froze, his mouth opening slightly, shock crossing his face, the sudden revelation cutting through the confidence he had carried all morning. David's voice was calm, firm, and unyielding as he said, "Officer Mark, you are currently part of an investigation for abuse of authority and involvement in activities that threaten the integrity of the department. Everything you have done today, and over the past weeks, has been carefully documented." The words hung in the air like a sudden storm, and for a moment, the street was silent, save for the faint hum of the idling vehicles and the whisper of the wind through the trees. Mark's hands twitched slightly, realizing the gravity of the situation, his eyes darting to the black sedan, which had remained parked, its occupants now observing, and his face went pale as he understood that the sting was not only well planned but inevitable, that every move he had made had been anticipated, recorded, and watched by professionals who had patience and precision on their side. David continued, his tone measured, "We allowed the encounters today to occur to gather evidence, to show the pattern of your behavior without confrontation. It is now clear that proper action must be taken." Mark swallowed, his voice shaky, unable to respond, the years of arrogance and suspicion replaced by the sudden weight of accountability. Meanwhile, David's agents emerged from their positions, plainclothed and calm, surrounding the area to secure it, all while maintaining order and ensuring that no harm would come to civilians nearby, because the operation had always prioritized safety and professionalism. David's eyes met Mark's, steady and unflinching, conveying the resolve that comes from a lifetime of commitment to justice, and in that look, there was no anger, only the unwavering focus of a man who had dedicated himself to protecting truth and exposing wrongdoing without letting emotion cloud judgment. Mark finally stepped back, understanding that resistance was pointless, that the sting had been flawless, and that his actions were now recorded for review, a clear demonstration of the consequences of misusing authority. David motioned for his team to secure the van and all equipment, ensuring that every recording, every piece of evidence, was collected systematically, leaving no chance for doubt or dispute. As the sun rose higher, bathing the street in soft light, David stepped back from the van, his disguise no longer needed, his mission complete, and allowed himself a small sigh of relief, knowing that weeks of patience, planning, and quiet observation had led to the truth coming to light. Civilians in the area, unaware of the drama that had played out, continued their morning routines, the neighborhood slowly returning to normal. Yet for David, this day marked a victory not only over corruption but also a reaffirmation of the careful, measured work that ensured safety, accountability, and trust. Officer Mark, escorted calmly to await further action, had learned that authority carried responsibility, that arrogance could never overpower truth, and that patience, courage, and preparation could turn even the most ordinary disguise into a force for justice. David returned to his van, now empty and ordinary once more, reflecting on the operation with quiet satisfaction, because though the street seemed the same, the world had shifted slightly, the shadows of abuse exposed, and the people who had once been silenced could now trust that there were those who would stand for them, silently, patiently, and without compromise. As he drove away from the warehouse, the sun fully above the horizon, David allowed himself a small, rare smile, knowing that the mission had succeeded, that the sting had worked exactly as planned, and that justice had been served through careful observation, intelligence, and unwavering commitment, leaving the city a little safer and the truth a little brighter.